And welcome back to our panel discussion, American Readiness, Renewable Power, and Efficiency Technologies, sponsored by Honeywell on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Roberto Guerrero, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy at the Air Force. Dan Ammon is the Senior Advisor for Energy, Planning, and Review for the Environmental Protection Agency. Major General Al Aycock, Director of Operations for the Assistant Chief of Staff for Installation Management at the Army, and Rear Admiral Kevin Slates, Director of the Energy and Environmental Readiness Division in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, and Mike Madsen. He is President of the Defense and Space Strategic Business Unit of Honeywell Aerospace. And in this segment, and I'm Tom Temin, your host, and in this segment I want to get into the technologies that actually make energy reduction happen. And let's talk about fuels, because whether it's on the ground, under the sea, on the sea, or in the air, everything burns something. Buildings all burn something. And earlier, Roberto, in the Air Force, you mentioned that there is a lot happening with respect to the types of fuels and also the way it's burned.
Sure. Yeah, over the past few years, we've been certifying all of our aircraft on a couple of different types of alternative fuels, and the purpose of that is it goes to one of our priorities, assuring supply, which is making sure, since we think we're pretty good at the engine to fuel interface, that where we go, the type of fuel that can burn on our aircraft is available, because it might not always be somewhere local. It might be a new vendor. We want to make sure that the Air Force's mission is flexible enough to use those different types of fuels. So the certification process took a little while. We were able to get there, and we were pretty happy with the results. Obviously, it has to meet our environmental, and our efficiency technical specifications to run different types of fuels on our aircraft. But we're pretty happy with the results. And as long as the market's available and the cost is competitive, we're going to use those type of fuels.
And can the same plane use two different types of fuels? Is that how it works? So
sure.
Whatever they put in there, it'll work.
That's correct. And you'll see on the side of most Air Force aircraft a whole list of different types of fuels that are certified for use for that particular aircraft. And obviously the crews know which ones are available.
Okay, and how about the Navy, which again has things that fly and float and go underwater? I guess those are all nuclear,
most
so we don't have to worry about that one.
Not so much the underwater stuff, sir. But I think the Navy's got some very aggressive goals for alternative fuel use, and SecNav has set a goal of 50% by 2020. So we're very interested in alternative fuels. And, alternative fuels for us, as in the Air Force, it's got to be drop-in. It's got to be transparent to the operator. It's got to have the same performance characteristics. And really what it does for both of us is it gives us greater flexibility of supply. It's not necessarily more efficient, but it gives us greater flexibility. We get our fuel from around the world, wherever we operate, just as the Air Force does. And having that alternative fuel is a great thing, because it, releases the bonds a little bit from the, maybe the fossil fuels, as well as, some of the places that make fuels aren't necessarily our best friends in the world. So we have a pretty aggressive certification program. There's actually a tri-service fuels group where we all work together on this, and the first ones have actually been, certified, and the military specifications modified. And then we all use DLA, the Defense Logistics Agency, to buy our fuel. So our first bulk fuel buy is out on the street right now, and DLA is analyzing it. So this will be kind of a milestone for us, the first contract that actually, is open to alternative fuel.
So it's as much a security and agility issue as it is an energy consumption issue.
Yes, sir. I think it's really, you could say it's a security, it's a resiliency, it's a flexibility. Not as much as maybe someday it'll be more intense power than, a gallon of petroleum today. But right now it's basically drop in, invisible, if you would, to the person operating that piece of equipment. But as the Air Force, what our guys do and what they do, obviously we're pretty stringent on our standards for fuel because of the performance requirements, especially up in the air.
Sure. And in the Army, you've got similar challenges.
We work hand in hand with the Air Force and the Navy in this particular area. But one of the success stories that we could highlight is the fleets of vehicles that run our installations. In our Basing Power Initiative, we've already met our federal goals for that 7 years in advance. We have been aggressively converting petroleum-based vehicles into alternative fuel vehicles and hybrid vehicles to the point where we've already met that goal.
All right, and Dan, of course, the civilian side of government has been very active in the whole issue of fleet efficiency. Is it possible to get ahead of the curve technologically, or is it a matter of just getting the right mix of vehicles to get to the best possible?
And what we tend to do is it's kind of walking a fine line between the low greenhouse gas vehicles, hybrids, alternative fuel vehicles, and then the heavy duty vehicles that really, in a lot of cases, can or cannot have those alternatives. So from us, from EPA and a lot of the civilian agencies, the hybrids are a big push right now. People like the hybrids. You get really good gas mileage. The prices are fairly reasonable, so people want hybrids. The problem with the hybrid vehicles is they don't use alternative fuels. It's gas. Mm-hmm. So you end up with having a problem then with your alternative fuel usage. So you kind of got to walk a fine line to meet the alternative fuel usage requirements while you're increasing your fleet and decreasing your petroleum usage. So it's kind of a combination of greenhouse gases and fuel and alternative fuel. So a lot of the civilian agencies, we're doing fine as far as the usage, and we're reducing our petroleum, but it does, as the requirements continue to increase, it becomes more and more difficult to get those increases while you're changing your composition of the fleet.
Sure. Mike?
Yeah, just to kind of recap what the team has said here, Honeywell's produced about 1 million or so gallons, a little over 1 million gallons of biofuel for the Department of Defense, which sounds
What is the source of it, by the way?
Different crops, jatropha, algae, camelina, but non-food crops. And I think this is, to kind of tie in what Roberto was saying, this is a big focus for us, is that we want to produce biofuels that are, A, fully compatible at the molecular level with the fossil fuel derived biofuels. They have to be drop-in replaceable, they have to be mixable. And unlike some of the stuff that you see out there that's been produced from other sources, which can be corrosive, doesn't have the same sort of stability, the biofuels that we and our other industry partners are focused on now are really drop-in replacements. And the attractive part about that is you don't have to make a vehicle modification. You don't have to be real careful about keeping it segregated from other sources of say, fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. You can actually put these together and run your vehicles with them just like you would pump gas or any other diesel fuel. The technology really is not the challenge here. We can produce this fuel in very large quantities. We've flown, the Thunderbirds have flown on our fuel, the Blue Angels have flown on our fuel. The key now is getting it economically to a point where it's at the same price per gallon as or barrel, if you will, as the biofuels or the fossil fuels. The good news there is that when you look at the economics of this, you don't have to make an enormous amount of this to get to that level. It actually comes down the curve pretty quickly. And the DoD and the Navy in particular has been really out in front of looking at this and sources of production and how do we get ramped up to a place where it's now competitive. And I think once that happens, you're going to see a lot of folks, our refinery partners are going to ramp up and everybody's going to be in this game. I would say that in terms of what it brings to the DoD, energy security is a big part of this. Of course, if you can make your own, you don't need to buy it from guys who may or may not be your allies at the time. And it can be economically as well a big deal because we've all seen there's spikes when there's shortages of supply, and you temper those spikes out when you can produce your own fuel. So it's a security issue and an economic
So just
issue.
to finish up on the vehicle piece of this, is the future hybrids or is it alternative fuel, or what about diesel? We used to hear that was a great way to use less fuel. Is that still part of this whole mix?
Well, from an industry perspective, I think you're going to see all of those. I think you're going to see turbochargers on. We produce the turbochargers in diesel engines and gasoline engines. You're going to see those continue to get greater use. You're going to see hybrid technology, particularly where I'd say smaller vehicles where the power requirements are lower. You're going to see the production of biofuels as drop-in replacements for both gasoline and diesel in vehicles because that doesn't require conversion. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a function of the challenge at hand with that specific service, I think.
It really goes down to what meets the mission. And so you look at each individual mission, you say, does a hybrid work here? Does alternative fuel work here? Or do I need to keep doing petroleum because I have to do it in this particular case to meet the mission requirements? And then to keep technology working to determine which of the future ones we can make modifications to, whether it's the modification to the, say, an airframe like a helicopter, or make a modification to the fuel.
Okay, and then also, I guess, connected with vehicles is the behavioral piece, which is a little tougher to get at, harder to measure, but this has come up a little bit. And Roberto, you were saying that there are behavioral activities to try to get people to have less lead foot when
Sure.
driving,
Well,
or is that part of the whole energy mix?
Well, from our aviation piece, what we've seen over the past few years is that Air Mobility Command does the majority, the bulk of our cargo from one place to another by various different ways of looking at the way they operate, by analyzing their procedures and through smart air refueling procedures, through smart fuel conservation. How high you fly makes a difference. How you load your aircraft makes a difference. All those things have resulted in them pretty significantly reducing their what we call a ton mile per gallon efficiency by about, I think it was 9%. So really what it comes down to is they're being more productive with the money that they have in order to use other funds to support other parts of the mission.
Is it possible to give people incentives for operating in the most efficient manner possible?
We have done that in the past, and we're looking at that for the future. That's definitely, coming from my safety background, it was an incentive to make sure that your behavior was such that you would not hurt yourself or damage the aircraft and affect the mission. It's the same type of thing that we're trying to look at here. When we look at behavior, we think there's a lot of possibilities for that, provided that we have the right type of measuring equipment to help us analyze what's going on.
So there's lead-footed drivers and there's also lead-footed pilots too? Is that a phenomenon that's real?
Well, Tom, one thing I would add to what Roberto said is it's the behaviors and the incentives, the technologies that exist today and are coming into the market now to help pilots and help folks operating ships operate them more efficiently is actually quite significant. We talked about the weather radar and the ability to avoid the really bad storms, but to fly direct when you can.
Sure.
Another one that's really taking hold with the Air Force in particular is GPS navigation aids, we call ground-based augmentation systems that allow pilots to fly a more direct approach, to fly shorter routes between points. We see this in the commercial space. We see this in the military space. It takes 5, 10, 15 minutes off a 1 or 2 hour flight. That's an enormous amount of fuel when you think about it in terms of dollars spent per year.
Sure.
And it also enables safety. It allows them to fly more safe. So I think it's a 2-for-1 there.
All right, so moving away from the kinetic assets, if you will, the things that roll or fly, everybody's got buildings, and there's still a large source of savings available there. What are some of the tools people use to get a handle on what it is that is happening with respect to installations in buildings? Dan?
We have EPA's inventory and a lot of the other federal government. We have some high-performance buildings, laboratories, specialty buildings, where building controls are a major issue with us and building ability to see how the buildings are performing. So the building control arena, as the Honeywell people I'm sure would like to talk about, has exponentially grown in the last few years. And the ability for us to control our buildings to a finer rate and get them under control in a lot of cases, pressurization, specialty usage is a big deal. And then the ability to have the smart meters that come up to a dashboard type system, as we were talking about earlier, or where an executive or a manager is able to look at that each day or each week and say, here's how my building is performing, here was an issue on this particular day, and down to this particular 15-minute interval, that you can then zero in on your problems, and then with an advanced building control system, be able to make some quick changes that you're able to fine-tune your buildings quickly.
Mm-hmm. What about some of the military installations? Are how do you know what's going on and to make sure you can measure it?
I think it's kind of the same, and even back to the operational thing. It's not so much that there's lead foot people or building abusers. I think a lot of it really boils down to giving people the best information, and if they have information. So ironically, we've even gone to like energy dashboards on ships so that people have some ability to see what am I using that's drawing power, and can I make some decisions? Just like the building system. I think, most of us are going to, I'm going to call it a smart grid, if you would, where we've got smart meters, we're tying in SCADA systems and, integrated control systems and, all that information so that we can better manage, building usage, power, know where we've got challenges and problems. And I think, not only does that help from a security standpoint, but it also helps from an efficiency standpoint. We can get after waste.
And going back to that, there's a behavioral aspect to this too, because a lot of times with these systems and these dashboards, you can get down to the room level and even down to the subsystem level. So you can look at this at the end of the day and say, in these specific laboratory modules or in these specific rooms, these people didn't turn off their lights. These people didn't close their fume hoods. So then you can send them an email. You can put a little sticker on their door. You can do different things to adjust people's behavior. And it makes a huge difference if you can get this down so that your profile at night and on the weekends and non-operational is actually what it should be versus 24/7 constant, because there is some variations. That's where you get some real changes in your behavior.
So the idea is if people can see and get that feedback, then they will go ahead and modify the behavior or do the thing that's needed to make sure that they stay within some kind of continuous process improvement.
Yeah.
It's a great point. If you give people the right tools, they'll do the right thing. And so within the Army, we have a facility investment strategy that highlights that we will look at energy and utility projects before we look at many other things. And we look at shortfalls in those particular facilities. But in addition, it's the metering process. It's getting people to be aware that we are going to meter those particular processes. And there's a competitive process to compete those projects that units want to do at their level so that we put our money into the right places.
Okay, and Mike, very quickly, are there still thermostat wars that happen?
Well, I think we call it smart buildings. The guy said it really well. Smart buildings that enable operators to do the right things, and in a lot of cases, we'll do it for them.
All right. Well, very interesting discussion. A lot of take-home pay here. I want to thank today's guests. Roberto Guerrero is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy at the Air Force. Dan Ammon is Senior Advisor for Energy Planning and Review for the Environmental Protection Agency. Major General Al Aycock is Director of Operations for the Assistant Chief of Staff for Installation Management at the Army. Rear Admiral Kevin Slates, Director of the Energy and Environmental Readiness Division in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, and Mike Madsen, the President of the Defense and Space Strategic Business Unit of Honeywell Aerospace. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.
On behalf of Honeywell Aerospace, thank you for joining us for this informative discussion.